Greetings. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's Book Talk with Marcy Dinius. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs at the Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources that we have been collecting here since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world, we use our collections with both physical and digital. We host programs like this one to provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. Today's program is sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. The virtual book talk series showcases authors' recently published scholarly monographs broadly related to book history and print culture. I am joined behind the scenes by my colleague Amanda Condek, Program Coordinator, who will be posting links and relevant information into the chat throughout the program. We will have time for your questions later in the program, and you can post your questions at any point during the program in the Q&A feature during the talk. And so we'll get to as many of those as possible after the presentation. And just note that the program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel next week. We thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep this work going, and thank you very much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. So Marcy, I'm going to ask you to turn on your video, yay. Dr. Marcy Dinius is Professor of English at DePaul University. She recently returned to Chicago from Tokyo, where she was a 2022 Fulbright lecturer at Tsuda University and at Ochana-Mizu University. Her work explores the means and limits of aesthetic and political representation. Her first book, The Camera and the Press, American Visual and Print Culture in the Age of the Daguerreotype, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2012. The book that she will be speaking about today, The Textual Effects of David Walker's Appeal, Print-Based Activism Against Slavery, Racism, and Discrimination, 1829 to 1851, was published earlier this year, also by Penn Press. We are delighted to have her with us here this afternoon. Marcy, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nan, and thank you to the Antiquarian Society for the invitation to speak today about my book, and to you all for making time in the middle of what I'm sure is a busy day to be here. All right, I'll start sharing my screen here. There we go. All right. David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, a 76 to 88-page pamphlet, self-published by Walker in 3 editions in Boston between 1829 and 1830, was one of the most influential texts published in 19th century America. For its rigorously reasoned and deeply felt arguments against U.S. racial slavery and anti-Blackness, and especially for its justifications of enslaved people's right to defend themselves and their families against tyrannous slaveholders, it motivated some of the strictest laws against Black literacy and mobility in the South during the slavery era. It also inspired William Lloyd Garrison. Oh, apologies. There was a giant leap there. Just a second, sorry. Okay. It also inspired William Lloyd Garrison to begin publishing The Liberator in Boston in 1831. As well as the American Anti-Slavery Society's print-centered political strategy and its 1835 Great Postal Campaign, which circulated hundreds of thousands of anti-slavery pamphlets throughout the South. This outpouring of radical anti-slavery print that started with Walker's Appeal occasioned vigorous Southern legal and extra-legal suppression of all anti-slavery print issuing from the North. Recent research has revealed the appeal's even hemispheric reach into Brazil in the mid-1830s, where it was invoked in print debates about race, citizenship, and Brazil's constitutional monarchy. For most of the 20th century, historians and literature scholars alike mostly understood Walker's pamphlet primarily in relation to the Nat Turner-led resistance in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, suggesting that it might have inspired the uprising, and as a founding text in the intellectual and political histories of radical Black nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Peter Hinks's 1997 monograph, To Awaken My Afflicted Brethren, David Walker and the Problem of Antebellum Slave Resistance, offered the first and is still valuable in-depth scholarly analysis of Walker, his appeal, and its context. Elizabeth McHenry's path-breaking 2002 book, Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African American Literary Societies, begins with Walker's appeal, and a sensitive, close, and contextual reading that positions it as emblematic of how print served as a crucial, quote, medium through which a sense of Black solidarity was communicated and achieved, end quote. More recently, the appeal features as a key text in Cheryl Wall's important attention to the neglected genre of the essay in African American literary history in her 2018 book on Freedom and the Will to Adorn. In The Textual Effects of David Walker's Appeal, I offer a new analysis of Walker's appeal and its direct influence on 5 politically and textually radical pamphlets that African American and Native American writers wrote and published in the United States and Canada between 1831 and 1851. I examine how African American activists and writers Mariah W. Stewart, William Paul Quinn, Henry Highland Garnet, and Paola Brown, and Native American activist and writer William Apess all answered Walker's appeal by taking up print as a powerful weapon against racism and slavery on Walker's model. And here are the title pages or the first pages of each of their pamphlets. These activist writers produced these pamphlets that challenged traditional relationships between the form and content of printed texts, the romantic idea of authorship as individualistic and entirely original, literacy as limited to the reading and writing of written language, and literature as strictly belletristic. Rather than being side effects of their pamphlets' aims to effect meaningful social change, and specifically the realization of the full equality promised by the principles of the American Revolution and its founding documents, Walker's, Stewart's, Quinn's, Apess's, Garnet's, and Brown's contributions to the developing print cultures of the United States and Canada are integral with their efforts to transform political and social culture nationally and internationally. This afternoon, I'll share the part of my book in which I've started to consider how Walker was not only influential, but was also influenced himself. Specifically, what follows focuses on Lindley Murray's English grammar as a more integral text to Walker's appeal and his strategies for reaching different kinds of readers than scholars have recognized to this point. Murray first published his grammar in England in 1795 as part of the Grand Enlightenment project to organize, regularize, and understand everything, and Walker specifically invokes it several times in his text. I presented a version of this talk at Penn's Material Text Seminar back in February and wanted to come back to Walker and Murray for the broader audience here in the Antiquarian Society's program in the history of the book in American culture, given Walker's fascinating bookishness. And I'd be very glad to talk about the book's chapters on Stewart, Quinn, Apess, Garnet, and Brown during the Q&A portion of our program. I'll spend the remainder of this formal part of my presentation taking us through how Walker both adopted and critically adapted the culturally and personally influential examples of late 18th century epistemology and philosophies of language, rhetoric, and pedagogy that he found in Murray's grammar to suit his and all African Americans' ends. I argue that by doing so, Walker not only extended, but also significantly transformed Enlightenment age philosophical inquiry, pedagogy, speaking, and writing in ways that made sure that these powerful modes of thinking, learning, and communicating were both available to and further transformable by all people of African descent. In Murray's English grammar, adapted to different classes of learners, as you can see the full version of its title here, Walker found an important and useful strategy for organizing his text for his different classes of readers, and a model for explaining this organization to them so that they would know how to make best use of it for his political and pedagogical text. Make best use of his political and pedagogical text. In Article 2 of Walker's appeal, which he dedicates to exploring our, quote, wretchedness and consequence of ignorance, he specifically notes that he has, quote, examined schoolboys and young men of color in different parts of the country in the most simple parts of Murray's English grammar, end quote, to assess the level and quality of their educations. His most educated Black and white readers equally and immediately would have understood why Walker was invoking this textbook as authoritative in relation to his inquiries. As Charles and E. Jennifer Monahan explain of Murray's grammar and his 1799 English reader, quote, Murray's works gained instant acceptance in the New Republic, and his works were reprinted by printers all over America, becoming steady sellers for 4 decades, surpassing even Noah Webster's totals. Murray sold 16 million copies of his works in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, thereby becoming, according to the Monahans, the largest selling author in the world. Among these many American reprintings, this 1825 edition of the grammar, printed by Thomas Bedlington in Boston, and that's also in the American Antiquarian Society's collections, would have been readily available to Walker while he was first writing his appeal in Boston in 1829. It includes Murray's original introduction to the text that explains both his textual strategies for reaching the different classes of learners indicated in its full title, as well as his philosophies of language, thought, and understanding that undergird the grammar. In explaining the latter, Murray declares most basically, quote, words are the sign of our ideas and the medium by which we perceive the sentiments of others and communicate our own, end quote. Because language is therefore the means, quote, with which we transfuse our sentiments into the minds of one another, a competent knowledge of words and their relation to each other and ideas is essential, end quote. Without it, Murray cautions, quote, we shall frequently be in hazard of misunderstanding others and being misunderstood ourselves, end quote. This hazard of misunderstanding is not only person to person, but ultimately social and with great consequences. Murray underscores, quote, many of the differences in opinions among men, with the disputes, contentions, and alienations of the heart, which have too often proceeded from such differences, result from want of proper skill in the connection and meanings of words, and a tenacious misapplication of language, end quote. Raising the stakes of this branch of learning even higher, Murray concludes by invoking fellow 18th century Scottish rhetorician and philosopher Hugh Blair, and this is Blair. All that regards the study of composition merits the highest attention upon this account, that it is immediately connected with the improvement of our intellectual powers. For I must be allowed to say that when we are employed in a proper manner in the study of composition, we are cultivating the understanding itself. That Walker took these lessons from Murray's introduction to Hart is apparent throughout his appeal, and especially so in Article 2, which again focuses on the importance of education for all African Americans. There, he specifically instructs his free and more liberally educated Black readers, quote, let the aim of your labors among your brethren, and particularly the youths, with the dissemination of education and religion. He also emphasizes to both his liberally and partially educated free Black readers that reading, quote, well, as trifling as it may appear to some, to the ignorant in particular, is a great part of learning. And he distinguishes this more advanced form of literacy from what he calls merely scribbling tolerably well. He closes his second article by citing an 8-year-old African-American boy from his home state of Massachusetts, who testifies that the local school committee has strictly limited instruction in grammar to white students only. As these passages in the appeal begin to suggest, Walker, like Murray and Blair, considered the in-depth study of grammar, which Murray breaks down as words, syntax, pronunciation, punctuation, and perspicuity and accuracy in spoken and written communication, as essential to the full development of all human minds and to understanding between all human beings. For Walker and African Americans, the stakes could not be higher. As Walker says, "There is great work for you to do, trifling as some of you may think it. You have to prove to the Americans and the world that we are men and not brutes, as we have been represented and by millions treated." I read Walker's emphasis here on the importance of studying grammar, and Murray's and Blair's messages about its centrality to cultivating human self and inter-understanding as an invitation to linger a bit longer on Murray's introduction to his grammar. By doing so, we can see how Walker also took to heart Murray's lessons about how to structure a complicated text on a highly complex subject, in his case, US racial slavery and discrimination, so that it would be both legible and useful in different ways to people with very different degrees of education. In the second paragraph of his introduction, Murray notes, and this is a bit longer quote, "In books designed for the instruction of youth, there is a medium to be observed between treating the subject in so extensive and minute a manner as to embarrass and confuse their minds by offering too much at once for their comprehension, and, on the other hand, conducting it by such short and general precepts and observations as to convey to them no clear and precise information." Walker recognized his need to strike such a balance, too, in presenting the historical developments and many depredations of US racial slavery. He acknowledges the complexity of this subject explicitly in his appeal's preamble. Quote, "The causes, my brethren, which produce our wretchedness and miseries are so very numerous and aggravating that I believe the pen only of a Josephus or a Plutarch can well enumerate and explain them," end quote. Murray offers the following strategy for addressing the numerous and aggravating complexities of English grammar. Quote, "A distinct general view or outline of all the essential parts of the study in which they are engaged, a gradual judicious supply of this outline, and a due arrangement of the divisions according to their natural order and connection appear to be among the best means of enlightening the minds of youth and of facilitating their acquisition of knowledge," end quote. In the appeal's preamble, Walker similarly explains how he has ordered his text using this divide and conquer approach, and this is Walker. "The sources from which our miseries are derived and on which I shall comment, I shall not combine in one, but shall put them under distinct heads and expose them in their turn." The sources of misery that Walker selects, and those are slavery, enforced ignorance, Christianity's perversion in service of slavery, and colonization, are the subjects of the 4 chapters that follow his preface. By specifically titling this preface a preamble, and the 4 subsequent chapters as Roman numeraled articles, Walker also reconstitutes the US Constitution into a foundational text in his history and grammar of anti-slavery and anti-racism. Yet his appeal's piecemeal treatment of these subjects, and thereby his reconstitution of the US Constitution, did not come at the cost of underrepresenting the ultimate horror and irrationality of race-based slavery. Walker warns his readers in the preamble, which, and I love this, he also refers to his preamble as his remarks on the suburbs, that when he enters, quote, "more fully into the interior of the system of cruelty and oppression," end quote, the main causes of Black American miseries that he presents in each article will be seen to, quote, "rage to such an alarming pitch that they cannot but be a perpetual source of terror and dismay to every reflecting mind," end quote. In that English grammar was likely more difficult than perpetually terrifying and dismaying for most of the students that Murray had in mind, he includes no such warning about his lessons rising to an alarming pitch. But Murray did recognize that in seeking to establish a middle ground between overwhelming complexity and overly reductive simplicity with his grammar, that middle necessarily would be different for readers at different levels in their educations. Accordingly, Murray explains the textual strategies that he devised for reaching these different classes of readers where they are. And as you can hopefully catch a glimpse here, typography is central to these strategies. And this is what Murray says about it. The more important rules, definitions, observations, and which are therefore the most proper to be committed to memory, are printed with a larger type, whilst rules and remarks that are of less consequence, that extend or diversify the general idea, or that serve as explanations, are contained in the smaller letter. Murray advises beginning students to focus on the lessons printed in the largest type and to postpone the finer points that he puts on them that are set apart in smaller type till, as he says, the general system be completed. And in this edition, it's a little bit harder to discern the different type sizes. I suspect these printers didn't follow Murray's guidelines quite as closely as they might have. And to adults who may be assisting younger learners in their lessons, either as parent teachers or as classroom teachers, Murray explains in his introduction that he has included, quote, notes and observations in the common and detached manner at the bottom of the page, or that is footnotes, as you can see the example here. In adopting these textual strategies, Murray tells us, care has been taken to adjust the text, quote, so that the whole may be perused in a connected progress, or the part contained in the larger character read in order by itself, end quote. That is, some readers will be best served by reading only parts of the grammar initially, then returning to read and learn more each time, and others by reading the whole of it at once. Either way, all readers will learn the same major lessons, with the most advanced readers learning them in greater detail. Walker also takes unusual advantage of typography and footnotes to add emphasis to his messages that he especially wants to foreground in his appeal, and you get just a small taste of that here. If you're interested in a detailed look at this, I've analyzed the typography of Walker's appeal closely in this PMLA article. But despite such typographic manipulations, Walker does not follow Murray's model of presenting his main points for his least literate audience and/or most hurried readers in larger type, and his subsequent elaborations of these points in smaller type. Instead, Walker places the main lessons that he wants all readers to take away at the start of all but one of the appeal's 5 sections, and perhaps you can get a glimpse of that here in the first paragraphs. And it's really the Article 4 that does not contain the statement right at the very beginning of a kind of summary statement of what that article is about. In that his lengthy elaborations of his 4 articles' topics constitute the majority of the text of the appeal, we can understand why Walker might have departed from Murray's model by choosing not to set the majority of his text in smaller type. That would have made for a much harder read. Scholarly readers who have been most attentive to Walker's strategies for addressing his different audiences do not seem to have discerned the pattern in how Walker organized his text, beyond its structure of a preamble in 4 articles. But I want to suggest that perhaps some of his 19th century readers might have been quicker to isolate how he placed his main points at or very near the beginning of each article, and that out of necessity they may have noticed this and may well have abridged the text accordingly, either to suit their own more limited reading abilities and time, or to abridge it for reading aloud for easier consumption by others, which is something that Walker explicitly asks for at a couple of points in his appeal, for readers who are among his most literate to read it aloud to the less literate. Even so, Walker suggests that his text does not need abridging for any readers. He concludes his appeal by submitting it to his, quote, brethren in language so very simple that the most ignorant who can read it all may easily understand, of which you may make the best of it you possibly can, end quote. In this closing statement of his pamphlet's legibility and his expectations of all its readers, I want to suggest again that we should recognize the influence of Murray's English grammar and the Enlightenment commitment to disciplined philosophical inquiry and mutual understanding that it pedagogically exemplifies. Like Murray, and no less than Murray, Walker offered his whole book to readers at all levels of literacy, with the expectation that they would read it intensively, progressing in their educations with each reading. While expecting such intensive engagement from enslaved readers might seem especially idealistic, if not impossible, given the strict controls on literacy, time, possessions, contact, mobility, and all other aspects of life in slavery, Walker was fully aware of these serious challenges to his aims for his pamphlet and its enslaved readers. At several points in the third and last edition of the Appeal, he includes discussions of how white Southerners legally prescribed instruction in literacy to enslaved people and how they violently punished enslaved people for trying to read or just possessing printed materials, including his Appeal. And if you've read Walker's Appeal, you might be tempted to contradict his claim that its language is quite so very simple. It's a very complex text in many ways, but some of it is quite simple, and a good deal of it is no more challenging than the basic aspects of Murray's English grammar. Recognizing this, I understand Walker as unwilling to concede to slavery, that his Appeal would go unreceived, unread, and not understood by enslaved people, and as equally unwilling to expect anything less of any of his African American readers than white Americans and Europeans expected of their children. That is to say, Walker wrote his Appeal with both the high-mindedness of an Enlightenment philosophe and even tougher love than the sternest pedagogues who taught Murray's grammar, setting the highest possible expectations for reading and learning, not because he expected all of his readers to meet them immediately, but because he wanted them to know that he was certain that all of them could meet them in time, through dedicated study, and with the right teachers, texts, and social and legal circumstances for learning. Unfortunately and understandably, we have limited evidence that Walker's text realized his aims among readers who were enslaved. Thus, the temptation to make the speculative case or cause and effect connection between the Appeal and the resistance associated with Nat Turner. But the September 28th, 1830 edition of the Boston Daily Evening Transcript newspaper contains one important record of its effects on the African-American citizens of Walker's Boston. And I'm grateful to Elizabeth McHenry for featuring this in her work. And this is the passage from the transcript. Quote, "Since the publication of that flagitious pamphlet, Walker's Appeal, we have noted a marked difference in the deportment of our colored population. It is evident that they have read this pamphlet. We know that the larger portion of them have read it or heard it read, and that they glory in its principles, as if it were a star in the east, guiding them to freedom and emancipation." With this account, we get a glimpse of how some within Walker's literate and less literate Northern African American audiences understood discursively, emotionally, and bodily his appeal and how it moved them. We see even more sustained impacts in the pamphlets that were written and published by Stewart, Quinn, Apess, Garnet, and Brown. But in the Boston Transcripts account, we also see how the appeal's powerful effects on African Americans and others were visible to white Americans, who clearly understood, either sympathetically or anxiously, that a racial hierarchy based on slavery and racism could be usurped, perhaps even by a Walker-inspired, Black-led Second American Revolution that finally realized the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality for all Americans. Thanks very much for your time and attention, and I'm really looking forward for your questions and thoughts towards discussion about the talk or about more about Walker's Appeal or Stewart's, Apess's, Quinn's, and Garnet's and Brown's pamphlets. Thank you.
Thank you. What a great talk. This is great because we have just about 30 minutes for your questions. So this is a good amount of time. You can put, as Amanda is just noting, you can put your questions directly into the Q&A, not into the chat, but into the Q&A, and we will read them back to Marcy and try to get to as many questions as possible. So feel free to go ahead and do that. And I just wanted to very quickly follow up, if I may, on something you just mentioned toward the end of your talk, the reference within the Boston Daily Evening Transcript, that the public had either read or heard the notice. And it makes me wonder if you think that and you did talk about how he abridged the text for reading aloud, but I'm wondering if you think his typography or his punctuation may have been presented with that in mind as well, as a way for reading and therefore emphasizing parts of it.
Yes, I do think that. And thanks very much for that question. It gives me an opportunity to narrate a little bit the kind of progress of this or the development of this project. As I mentioned in that PMLA article that I published way back in 2011, I think it was now, that was an article that really focused on the unique typography of Walker's Appeal, and especially on how, in my reading in that article, the typography is deliberately crafted so to direct readers in how to voice it aloud, almost like musical dynamic markings in printed sheet music. And I looked across the different editions, the 3 editions of the appeal, and it's very interesting. In the 2nd edition, maybe perhaps the typesetter for that edition thought, oh, you don't need all those exclamation points, or maybe he ran out of the number of exclamation points in his typecase, and he dropped some of them out and otherwise altered the punctuation. Well, very interestingly, they come back in the 3rd edition. So it seems clear that Walker was reading this closely and had a strong sense of just how he wanted his voice presented on the page so that it would give directions in how to voice it aloud. And it also works visually for those who are reading it silently, right? Some of those passages just leap off the page visually at you, and you literally can't miss what's being emphasized. And so when I started thinking about carrying this project forward and what more to do with it, I had to think about a way to think more about Walker's Appeal and its effects beyond just this reading aloud, but also, again, how it actually moved people to some kind of action. And the way that I chose to focus that was really looking at these 4 other pamphlets, or is it 5? I've lost track. And thinking about, these were authors and activists that were so moved to activism through print to sit and craft their own pamphlets, especially in ways that extend Walker's Appeal to groups that it doesn't particularly represent or advocate for, such as African American women and Native Americans, or African Americans later in time in the 1840s, as slavery has gotten even worse, right? And political conditions have deteriorated. And so the kind of visual effects of this text and how readers were so directed in just, kind of absorbing as much meaning from it as possible, have this long-term effect over time in reaching readers who were moved enough to write their own text, and then to write text that would also move readers to advanced action based off Walker's additional appeal, to extend those appeals for rights to an even greater number of groups. Very interestingly, none of the other authors have the same kind of typographic and voice fireworks as in Walker's Appeal. They have some emphasis in different ways, but none quite go for it as much as Walker did in his text. And I have a bunch of different thoughts about why that might be so, but his in this grouping is by far the most remarkable visually and orally in that way.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And that leads very nicely, segues to our first question from Nell Painter about wanting you to say a bit more about Mariah Stewart's response.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So Stewart, there are so many things to say about Stewart's response. And other scholars have said this too, about how directly influenced she was by Walker to make this appeal and extend it to African American women, and specifically make an appeal to African American women, not just on behalf of African American women, but to African American women, really calling on them to uplift themselves. And that the way that I look at that is in the chapter dedicated to Stewart, is that William Lloyd Garrison, who sponsored the publication of Stewart's pamphlet, I think might have recognized kind of his ideal advocate in Stewart, in that she was somewhat as politically and rhetorically fiery and feisty as Walker. There are some moments in there where she says kill, burn, destroy, and that's what she's not advocating, but yet those words kill, burn, destroy are in there. But at the same time, she's really arguing for advancement through what we might think of as kind of traditional propriety and uplift. And so this very much fit with kind of Garrison's double-forked politics and approach, right? And so I think that, and I argue in that chapter that the timing of this, of Stewart's pamphlet, came really ideally for Garrison at a kind of vulnerable moment for the liberator, that he gained those early years of support from largely African-American subscribers. And here was an African-American woman author that he was able to publish and endorse, but that worked as a real kind of mutual endorsement. And so that it maybe wasn't quite as much that he was sponsoring the publication of her pamphlet as it was that she was almost sponsoring the liberator in some sense too, by expanding the audience that Walker's appeal originally went to, well, literally doubling it, right, by appealing to African-American women too. So that's a kind of quick summary of some of my thinking about both the nature of Stewart's appeal, but also the kind of print context in which it was functioning, right, immediately in the wake of Walker's death. So thanks very much for that question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Manisha Sinha has a question for you. She says you delineated the influence of Mary's grammar in Walker well, and in your book, his influence on other Black intellectuals and activists. But can you speak about the influence of early and contemporary Black radicals on Walker, like William Hamilton, Austin Stewart, and other Black abolitionists?
Yes, yeah, that's really important, and that's something that I want to think more about. It's interesting in the next phase of this work is looking back more at those who influenced Walker instead of forward at who he influenced. And I really think the Black abolitionists that he personally was involved with as part of the Massachusetts General Colored Association were hugely influential in a way that I think him titling his appeal as Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world really misrepresents, right? And that there's a real playing into that kind of solo authorship and the romantic ideal of the single author, right? Is almost, if anything, just divinely influenced rather than influenced and drawing these ideas from community and real community activism, that there are aspects of the appeal that really underrepresent that. And I find it also fascinating, and I appreciate this provocation, that among his footnotes, he's a quite diligent footnoter of his sources. Unless I'm mistaken, and I don't believe that I am, I can't remember him footnoting a single African-American source. I believe all of the sources that he engages with are white American or European authors. And so that's another interesting version of the kind of submersion of the real intellectual community in which these ideas were forged, right? And without which they couldn't have come to be represented on the page too. So there's a dissonance in that that I would love to explore further in future work. I can't imagine ever ending work on Walker's appeal. So I really appreciate that invitation. Thank you.
Great. Here's an interesting question from Dee Andrews. Really enjoyed the presentation. Looking forward to reading your book. Wondering about, in terms of oral rhetoric, wondering if the book discusses the impact of Wesleyan rhetoric on Walker's approach, given his African Methodism and great admiration of Bishop Allen. So much of the appeal reads like a revival sermon, and of course he ends with a hymn that Wesley published and was then set to music by Lowell Mason, who, back to your thesis, was apparently a pioneer in musical notation and musical grammar. And I guess the hymn was published in Boston in 1824, where Mason was living.
Oh, this is fantastic. This is all wonderful. Yes. And so this is another thing that I've wanted to think a lot about. And it's trying to figure out like which books about Walker's appeal these could be. And the Methodist influence is a crucial one, and one that I really underrepresented in this talk in favor of focusing on the more pedagogical, explicitly pedagogical, and focus on grammar. But yes, absolutely, Wesleyan rhetoric and the Wesleyan influence, both through the African-American Methodist churches, but also through English Methodism and the incredible textual basis of Methodism, but also the kind of, how to put it, not only that attention to the kind of musicality and the musical possibilities of text, but also in some ways that I'm interested in exploring the kind of defiance of conventions of print that, as I'm sure you know, Wesley was a kind of flagrant plagiarizer, right? And was taken to court over this several times. And so that there is within the tradition of Methodist print, this interesting borrowing and inter-influence, but that also gets masked through kind of the usual, or can be masked through some of the usual protocols of print. So yes, this Methodist influence is equally, and in some places certainly more, it exerts more of a presence, more of a force on Walker than some of the more secular, Enlightenment-oriented, more logical, I would say, than the affective structures coming from Methodism. So that I don't want to completely divide them that in way to say that the focus on grammar and Murray's grammar and the kind of Enlightenment epistemological ways of knowing and expressing oneself are only the logical ones, and that the Methodist parts are only the effective ones. But I think there's a wonderful intermixing happening through those really two dominant strains of influence on Walker. So thank you.
I wonder if you wanted to just say a few words about Walker's influence on Quinn, given that you're...
Yeah, the Quinn is fascinating. And honestly, that was a very late chapter in the book where I thought, oh my goodness, I have to write a chapter about this Quinn pamphlet. And it's in some ways, it's so mysterious because we don't know that much about Quinn, despite how prominent a figure he was, ultimately rising to a bishopry in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so but we don't know very much about the circumstances of its publication either. And it's, again, in the kind of Wesleyan mode, it's got that whole section that just straight lifts from Walker's appeal without any acknowledgement. And so I find that text a really interesting hybridization of the Wesleyan Methodist kind of uses of text, and also especially he was a colporteur as well. And so that way of preaching on the page as well as through print, I think, is happening much in his pamphlet like it is in Walker's, but in ways that don't register quite as visually clearly as in the appeal. And so it's a very interesting hybrid text of literally borrowing from Walker's appeal, but also very much influenced by traditions in Methodist print by that point too.
Yeah, great. Here's a question from Cabria Baumgartner. Thanks for the great talk. Your analysis of Walker's typography made her wonder if there's any evidence that Walker may have been trained as a printer. And related to that, what is known about Walker's educational background and his own work as an educator?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think anyone has recovered any evidence that Walker worked as a printer himself. We do know that he was, through Peter Hinks's research and others, that he was a dealer in used clothing in Boston, that he lived on Beacon Hill, and his shop, I forget if it was my Boston geography has gotten a little bit rusty, but it was in Boston, primarily selling clothing to African-American sailors, but also to white sailors as well. And so when there was such controversy about his appeal, and literally governors and mayors from the South were writing to the mayor of Boston to go arrest and indict Walker for circulating this pamphlet, basically it gave his work as a dealer in used clothes kind of gave Boston authorities political cover in some ways to do nothing. They said, oh, he's just a dealer in used clothes. He poses no threat. Well, as has come up in this conversation, he was also a very prominent activist in the Massachusetts General Colored Association. He was active in the Prince Hall Masons. He had published in it was in the Colored American, right? I believe It's funny, I've gotten rusty on the early Walker. A speech that he gave, a very fiery speech that's a kind of almost precursor to the appeal. And so Peter Hinks theorizes, and other scholars who've tried to poke more into the print history of the appeal, theorize that this is maybe how he first engaged these printers in Boston that we suspect printed the appeal, David Houghton and Matthew Tepperell. And they were lefty printers involved with printing kind of working man's, they were active in the kind of labor movement, and don't seem to have been particularly abolitionist, but again, on that kind of political spectrum. And that he must have had some kind of a relationship, enough of a relationship with them to make pretty significant demands of printers to get this text to look like he wanted it to. And so my working hunch is that it's that Walker, in his real self-education, it seems, and not just self-education, but again, as Professor Sinha pointed out, in community with this other group of activists, that we have to think we're reading and we know we're reading and exchanging books, that he was a very textual being, in some ways a lot like we've gotten used to thinking of Frederick Douglass doing by his work as an editor, right? That just in reading and thinking through and talking about so many different texts, and really not entirely basing their activism in text, but being certainly very textually oriented in their activism, that this gave Walker a really heightened attention to the power of print on the page. And so that's, again, my working theory of where that comes from. His even motivation to do that to his own text comes from.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Let's see, Manisha notes that Freedom's Journal Colored American was printed after he died.
It's the early, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. It's the earlier, I can't right now, it's slipping my mind horribly, which earlier newspaper it was in.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, your first book is this wonderful analysis of images and texts and how different types of 19th century Americans might have viewed and read them. And I wondered how the work that you did for that influenced your work for this book.
Thank you. That's a hard question, a good question. In some ways, I think the PMLA article about the typography is the hinge. Mm-hmm. That I went from looking at how in the United States, in the context of the United States, the introduction of the first form of photography was initially more a textual event than a visual event, because of Americans reading about reports of this first form of photography, this new radical form of representation, through written accounts published in newspapers and magazines that really oriented them in how to see it and respond to it. And so and then continuing that through looking at literary examples of wrestling with this new form of representation. And I went from thinking about not just how written texts were trying to represent what was almost unrepresentable in the visual, to thinking about written text, printed texts, as visual forms of representation themselves. And I don't quite remember the timeline of this, but I had been introduced to Walker's Appeal as an undergraduate by Professor Erskine Peters at Notre Dame, and I had always kept my copy of Walker's Appeal because I'd found it particularly moving always. And for some reason, I went back to it again when I was in graduate school, and it just was stunned once again at how visually remarkable this was. And it just stayed with me. And through teaching it repeatedly, I thought, well, I need to finally write something about this, that this is such an unusual text in this respect. And so it really emerged from there. But I would say another thread that I realized, it took me more time to realize this, that I had in common, was why I've been interested in these different modes of representation in their intersection, especially in this moment in 19th century America, is that they inevitably overlap with or intersect with and interact with limitations in our understandings of the human and what is human and what are human capacities. And so in thinking about the daguerreotype, for example, that it was first trumpeted and long trumpeted as this form of representation that was, because it was entirely mechanical, exceeded the limitations, the now paltry limitations of the human hand and eye in drawing and painting. And so that kind of shame about human limitations or human ability for that to be expressed in the very moment, or the very long moment, of definitions of who counted as human and not, and because of what qualities, is a place that I've really stayed in my scholarship and thinking. And so this book currently represents just a slice of that, in different writers who wanted to advocate for the aspect of human identity or disidentification or removal from humanity that they felt most particularly identified by and as. And so I think the continuing work that I'm doing on this is going, again, as I mentioned, backwards into the 18th century to see not just the kind of previous activist roots for Walker's and others' thinking in this moment, but also like the roots of that late 18th century, as I mentioned, organization of everything, including humankind as either the same or different species. And when capacities of representation, political and aesthetic, are being invoked in those debates so strongly. And it's precisely those debates that Walker also engages with repeatedly in invoking Thomas Jefferson in the Appeal. So that's the kind of big picture connection of all of these connections.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And the whole question of audience is something that you pay such close attention to. And it makes me think it might be nice for you to say a little bit about audiences, the new audiences that these other writers were reaching, and maybe if there's anything you might want to say about reaching white audiences
Yeah, maybe I'll start with Paola Brown, my Canadian African American, right? Mm-hmm. He has a kind of sketchy background and a sketchy life in some ways. He was accused a couple of times of fraud once he was up in Canada, of fraudulent fundraising and other things. But I think he was just very political, and people, it's hard to say whether or not he was, but fraudulently fundraising, but he was extremely political, and he was interested. One of the ways that, and also explicitly borrowing from Walker's Appeal without any or attribution, he has these moments in his pamphlet where he wants to address white Canadians. And he is trying to be particularly reassuring to white Canadians that the influx of African Americans into Canada, what was then called Upper Canada, especially in the wake of the fugitive slave law, right, which was driving people north in just unprecedented numbers, that they are friends and not foes. And so there are many moments in that text where he bends over backwards to affirm his and other African Americans, now Canadian Africans, loyalty, especially as citizens, to their new nation and to their neighbors. And so I read this not just as a kind of moment of playing to his potentially unfriendly audience, but also like a real revelation of how unwelcoming a lot of white Canadians must have been to this new community, in these new communities that were popping up in the wake of the fugitive slave law, such that we can see Brown felt a need to try to reassure them, right, and tried to put out a kind of olive branch of them being in accord and being hard workers and valuing the same nation and flag of what would be this new country for these new groups of people. And so that's just one example of an extension out to white audiences that we see really all of these authors engaging at the same time as they're engaging with their own communities. So there's always a kind of double spokenness and a double consciousness, at least double, in each of these pamphlets. And that started with Walker's Appeal too. There's so many moments in it where he's addressing, oh, Christians, right? And he almost always means that, like, to point out their hypocrisy, where we see, again, that kind of not divided attention, but necessarily dual attention. And again, if not more than dual, to having addressed one's own community and own population, as well as the inevitable white audience that they knew that they were interacting with, and that ultimately had, you know, a larger degree of power to make some kind of changes about what they were appealing for.
Right, and I'm thinking also of the was it Quinn sort of appealing to or reaching the legislators
Yes,
right?
yes. There are explicitly political moments in that pamphlet where he's appealing to legislators, not even though he's writing from Ohio, to I think legislators from one of the Carolinas. That he's intervening in other state politics from the American frontier at that point. And so that's one of the things I really love about each of these authors too, is that despite being very conscious of where they were publishing locally, they also have such grand ambitions for who they're going to reach, and that they speak directly well beyond their immediate locale out to other states, to even other countries, and of course, most broadly with Walker, to the world. And so there's just that refusal of any kind of limitations on the possibility of audience. And I understand that not just as a kind of boldness, but also a real recognition of the kind of unlimitedness of print, that it had legs and could go places that even they couldn't imagine. And so they were going to imagine as big as they possibly could and speak in those ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's really great work, and it's a great read, and so much wonderful information in the book. I have to say, I wanted to look at a copy from our collections of Walker's Appeal, just to see what kind of use one could read from the pamphlet itself. And I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at examples of all of these, just to see, the fact that they were really read. And it's great to see that in archival examples.
It is. It is.
I think we managed to get through. There are a lot of comments yet in the Q&A, but I think we got through all of the questions. So I wanted to just extend again thanks to you for this great presentation. And I want to let everyone know about our next book talk in this series, which will be on Thursday, December 1st, again at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Jeffrey McCullough will be presenting on his book, Publishing Plates: Stereotyping, Electrotyping in 19th Century U.S. Print Culture, published by Penn State University Press this month, in fact. So that talk will be again on December 1st. So I hope you can join us then. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, thank you, Marcy, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you all so much.